Ma'am, step away from the machine.
Officer, the ATM malfunctioned and took my card. I'm just trying
I need to see your ID.
I was depositing a check. The machine isn't working. My wallet is in my purse. May I reach for it?
What are you doing at this ATM?
I don't understand. I haven't
Sure
done
you
anything
are.
wrong.
Turn around and place your...
Margaret Williams froze, her fingers still hovering over the ATM keypad. Her heart skipped. The words came from a young police officer standing in the vestibule, hand near his sidearm, eyes fixed on her. She held her phone in one hand, purse in the other, trying to stay calm. Officer, the ATM malfunctioned and took my card. I'm just trying to. I need to see your ID, the officer interrupted. Margaret's brows furrowed. I was depositing a check. The machine isn't working. My wallet is in my purse. May I reach for it? The officer's gaze hardened. What are you doing at this ATM? I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong, she said, her voice steady but tense. Sure you are. Turn around and place your... Before he could finish, Margaret realized the situation was rapidly escalating. The machine had frozen, a blank screen staring back at her. The check she had inserted disappeared somewhere inside, along with her debit card. She had pressed every button, called the bank's customer service, and received the standard instructions. A technician would arrive within 24 hours, but the card would be destroyed. What she hadn't expected was that someone watching her on security cameras would call the police. Inside the bank, Tyler Clark, a 24-year-old security guard on his third week of work, had been monitoring the cameras. He had seen Margaret pressing buttons, inserting things into slots, examining the machine closely. Tyler remembered a short online training video about ATM fraud. In that video, criminals manipulated machines to capture card data or exploit software glitches. Margaret's frustration looked like tampering. Tyler panicked and called the non-emergency police line. He described someone tampering with the ATM without considering that it might be a customer having trouble. Officer Nathaniel Reed, 29, with 6 years on the force, received the assignment. 2 blocks away, he grabbed his keys and headed out. He parked with headlights illuminating the vestibule, spotting a well-dressed black woman holding her phone and purse. He approached quickly, hand hovering near his holster. Step away from the ATM, he ordered again. I already told you, it's malfunctioning. I'm just trying to retrieve my card. Margaret said calmly, though her stomach tightened. Reed's training had drilled him to distrust plausible cover stories. He had been told that guilty people often had explanations ready. Margaret's calm voice did not reassure him. He demanded her ID. I need to reach into my purse for it, she replied, her voice even carefully cautious. May I? Reed's eyes narrowed. Innocent people just get their ID. Step aside. Margaret hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. She knew stories of black women being harmed for minor misunderstandings. She complied, slowly reaching for her wallet, but Reed interpreted her caution as resistance. Step away from the machine now. Margaret moved a step back, hands raised slightly, her phone still in hand. Officer, I am Dr. Margaret Williams, former city treasurer. I'm conducting normal banking business. This is my routine. Reed frowned. He had never heard of her, didn't know who a city treasurer was, and assumed she was asserting authority to manipulate him. Turn around, he said sharply. I'm asking for a supervisor, Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but the fear underneath was clear. This is unjustified. The machine malfunctioned. I am a customer, not a criminal. Reed stiffened, taking her request as a challenge. He reached for handcuffs. You are being detained for suspicious activity and interference with banking operations. Margaret froze. Handcuffs. I've done nothing wrong. You need to cooperate. Turn around. Put your hands behind your back, he commanded. Margaret knew better than to resist. Stories of black people being injured or killed for questioning police authority had been ingrained in her since she was young. She turned slowly, carefully placing her hands behind her back. The cold metal snapped shut around her wrists. Please, I am a retired city treasurer. I've served the city for 34 years. I hired the chief 6 years ago. This is my bank. Do you know what you're doing? She said, voice rising in disbelief. Reed remained impassive. You're under detention. Step to the car. Margaret's legs moved as instructed, but her mind raced. She had spent decades managing budgets, overseeing hundreds of millions of dollars, personally improving police officers' benefits. She had fought for proper funding for vehicles, salaries, and equipment. And now, here she was, cuffed and humiliated in front of strangers, treated as a criminal for doing what she had done safely hundreds of times before. The parking lot filled with quiet tension. A few bystanders recorded the scene on their phones, whispering among themselves. Margaret could see the disapproving looks and the confusion in people's faces. Her humiliation was compounded by the knowledge that this could go viral, that the story they would tell in seconds could reduce her decades of service to a single arrest clip. Backup arrived in the form of Officer Lisa Grant, a 28-year-old officer who had been patrolling nearby. She walked up, eyes scanning the scene. "What's going on?" she asked. Reed explained quickly. "Suspicious activity at the ATM. I'm detaining her." Grant walked over to the ATM, examining it. "It's malfunctioning, exactly as she said," she said. Her eyes flicked to Reed, and she shook her head slightly. "You might want to reconsider this detention." Reed's jaw tightened. "We'll sort it out at the station." Margaret was guided into the patrol car, sitting in the back seat, handcuffs digging into her wrists. Her purse and phone were taken as evidence. She felt surreal, watching the city she had served pass by, the buildings she had funded, the parks she had overseen, the police pensions she had fought for, all in this vehicle as a detained citizen. Inside, she whispered to herself, trying to calm the storm inside her. This isn't about me. It's about assumptions. It's about what people see when they look at me. It's about being black in this city. The ride to the station felt endless. Every red light, every stop sign emphasized her helplessness. The city she loved, the same city she had managed financially, now seemed hostile. The officer's silence was loud in the confined space, his hand occasionally brushing against the car door as if reminding her of his authority. Margaret took a deep breath. She knew she would remain dignified. Decades of public service had taught her the value of composure under pressure. But her heart pounded as she thought about what this meant. Not just for her, but for every black person who could be stopped, humiliated, or worse, for the slightest reason. At the station, Sergeant Michael Torres looked up from his desk as Reed opened the car door. Margaret stepped out slowly, wrists sore and wrists reddened from the handcuffs. "Sergeant, I." Torres stopped mid-sentence as he recognized her. Shock spread across his face. Margaret Williams, former city treasurer, stood handcuffed in front of him. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. "Officer, what did you just?" Reed's confident posture faltered. Margaret's words came quickly, as the truth tried to break through the tension. "I've served this city for 34 years. I managed millions of dollars. I hired your chief. And now I am being treated like a criminal because of a machine and your assumptions." Torres's expression turned from shock to disbelief. He gestured to Reed. "Explain yourself." Reed began reciting his justification, but Margaret could see the uncertainty creeping into his tone. He had acted based on suspicion, not evidence. The arrest was technically lawful, but morally indefensible. Margaret's career, her decades of service, her integrity, all brought to this point of humiliation because someone assumed guilt before confirming the facts. Margaret's voice stayed steady, sharp, and clear. I am not a suspect. I am a citizen. I am a retired treasurer. And what has happened here is unacceptable. Torres glanced at her, realizing the severity of the mistake. Let's get these cuffs off, he said, reaching for the key. Margaret's hands finally freed, but the emotional bruises ran deep. She would never forget how quickly authority and assumptions could overshadow years of service and trust. The station air felt cold and sterile, but Margaret refused to show weakness. She stood tall, regaining composure, silently promising herself that this would not define her. She would fight this, not just for herself, but for the principle of justice. The first chapter of her ordeal was over. The legal battle, public scrutiny, and personal struggle had yet to begin. But one thing was certain. Even decades of service could not shield a black woman from being judged, humiliated, and assumed guilty. And Margaret knew the fight for accountability would be relentless. Margaret sat in the small interview room at the police station, her wrists still tender from the handcuffs, her blouse slightly wrinkled, her calm composure belying the storm inside her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Officer Reed paced outside the door, waiting for backup to return. Every second felt like a lifetime. She had spent decades in City Hall managing millions, influencing budgets, funding programs, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal at 7 in the evening. Meanwhile, the first video appeared online. A bystander, one of the few who had recorded her in handcuffs at the ATM, uploaded the clip to Twitter at 7:34 p.m., simply captioned, "Police activity at First National downtown. Looks like someone got arrested at the ATM. Probably fraud or theft." Within minutes, people were sharing it, speculating, some outraged, some defensive. Another video appeared on Facebook at 7:36 p.m., this time zoomed in, showing her face clearly. Comments poured in, questions, guesses, assumptions. None of the commenters knew who she was. A third clip, on Instagram at 7:38 p.m., carried the caption, "Banking while black, I guess hashtag justice for her, hashtag police accountability." Margaret had no way of knowing this yet. She only felt the weight of humiliation, the grinding frustration that years of service could be erased in seconds by a handcuff and a misinformed officer. Her daughter, Jennifer, first heard about it at 7:52 p.m. from a friend's text. "Is this your mom?" with a video link. Jennifer's stomach dropped. She watched in horror as the mother who had taught her integrity, responsibility, and grace was reduced to a viral clip. She tried calling Margaret, but the phone had been taken as evidence. Panic rose in her chest as she scrolled through social media, seeing clips multiply, people adding commentary, labeling, and judging. Inside the station, Sergeant Torres had called for a quick assessment. Officer Lisa Grant confirmed what Margaret had been saying. The ATM was indeed malfunctioning. The evidence was clear. Torres, a 16-year veteran, immediately recognized Margaret. Shock and embarrassment washed over him. "This cannot be happening," he muttered. "This woman. This is Dr. Margaret Williams." He quickly flagged Lieutenant Elaine Morrison, a 22-year veteran who had known Margaret personally from city events. Morrison arrived within a minute, pale, and immediately removed the handcuffs herself. "I am so sorry," Morrison said quietly, placing a hand on Margaret's shoulder. Margaret gave a small nod but stayed silent, letting her anger simmer. She knew apologies wouldn't erase the public humiliation she had already endured. Lieutenant Morrison quickly called Police Chief Harrison. Harrison, home for dinner, answered in surprise. Morrison explained urgently. A former city treasurer had been arrested at an ATM due to a malfunction and officer error. Harrison dropped his fork and immediately drove to the station. By 8:10 p.m., he arrived, walking into the small interview room. The sight of Margaret, disheveled and cuffed moments ago, hit him like a punch. His trusted treasurer, the woman who had hired him, fought for his pension, and supported him personally, now looked at him with quiet fury. "Chief Harrison, I—" Margaret began, but he held up a hand. I know, Margaret, I am deeply sorry. This should never have happened." Her shoulders stiffened, and she said, "Sorry isn't enough. The problem is bigger than this officer's actions. The system allowed this to happen in the first place. Assumptions were made, evidence ignored, and my identity dismissed." Meanwhile, the viral videos were spreading faster than the officers could react. TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. Every platform lit up with clips. By 8:00 p.m., the hashtag #BankingWhileBlack was trending locally, with over 1,200 posts. The narrative was forming. A black woman, well-dressed and middle-aged, handcuffed at an ATM in a respectable part of the city. The city's citizens, online and off, were outraged. Mayor Linda Fitzgerald, at a fundraising dinner, had seen the videos. By 8:15 p.m. her stomach sank. She immediately called Harrison, who reassured her that Margaret had been released and was safe, but he warned. The videos were already viral, and the story would spin without context. By 8:47 p.m., Harrison and Fitzgerald agreed. A press conference must happen within 2 hours to control the narrative and offer clarity. Inside the station, Margaret prepared. Her daughter Jennifer arrived at 9:00 p.m., flinging herself into her mother's arms. "Mom, I can't believe this is happening. Are you okay?" Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. Margaret hugged her tightly. "I'm okay, Jennifer, but okay isn't enough. We have to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Public Information Officer Sarah Lynn briefed Margaret. "Stick to facts. Explain what happened. Focus on training and accountability, not personal anger. But be honest about trauma." Margaret nodded. She didn't need coaching to tell the truth. Her life had been reduced to a viral clip, her dignity questioned, and she intended to make every word count. By 10:15 p.m., the press room was packed with reporters and camera crews. Harrison, Mayor Fitzgerald, and Margaret walked to the podium. The mayor spoke first. Earlier this evening, a former city treasurer, Dr. Margaret Williams, was mistakenly detained at an ATM due to a series of misunderstandings. The officer involved has been placed on administrative leave, and a full investigation is underway. Footage will be made public. This situation is unacceptable, and measures will be taken to prevent a repeat. Then Margaret approached the microphone. Her voice was calm, deliberate, piercing. At 7:12 p.m., I arrived at the First National Bank ATM to deposit a routine check. The machine malfunctioned. I attempted to retrieve my card. Officer Reed approached and immediately assumed I was engaged in suspicious activity. I complied with every request. I identified myself repeatedly, stating clearly that I am Dr. Margaret Williams, former city treasurer with over 34 years of public service. Yet my words were dismissed, my intentions doubted. I was handcuffed and detained while performing ordinary banking activity in a location I have frequented for 15 years. She paused, letting the words sink in. Cameras clicked, reporters murmured. This was not a personal failure alone. Margaret continued. It was a failure of training, protocol, and assumptions. The officers involved acted on incomplete information and implicit bias, escalating a routine banking problem into a humiliating detention. My identity was confirmed only because I happened to be someone with public visibility. Most people do not have a chief, sergeant, and mayor acknowledging their innocence within minutes. Most people do not have social media rapidly correcting the narrative. Yet, the harm, the fear, the humiliation remains. Questions came fast. Dr. Williams, what do you want done about this? Do you believe systemic racism played a role? Will you pursue legal action? Margaret answered directly. She emphasized accountability, systemic training failures, and her decision to pursue legal action. Not for money, but to ensure consequences and prevent recurrence. She made it clear, this wasn't just about her. It was about anyone vulnerable to assumptions and quick judgments by authority. By the time the press conference ended at 11:23 p.m., the narrative had shifted dramatically. The woman in handcuffs was no longer a random black customer. She was a respected former official. The outrage was intensified, not lessened. Social media exploded again, now with context, statements, and corrections. Margaret's statement was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Discussions ignited nationwide about racial profiling, policing practices, and the fragility of public perception. The first steps toward justice had begun. But Margaret knew this was only the beginning. Viral videos, public scrutiny, and policy discussions could not erase the humiliation she experienced in those 8 minutes at the ATM. She was determined to channel her anger and knowledge into action. The fight for accountability would be relentless, and her platform, earned over decades of service, would be the tool to make change. This incident was more than an arrest. It was a mirror showing how assumptions, bias, and lack of training could turn authority into oppression in an instant. Margaret understood the stakes. Personal dignity, public accountability, and systemic reform were all intertwined, and she was ready to fight on all fronts. The morning after the press conference, Margaret Williams returned home, still exhausted from the ordeal. Her wrists throbbed, her mind replaying the humiliating handcuffing at the ATM. Yet, she felt a sense of resolve. She would not allow this experience to fade as just another viral incident. Decades of public service had taught her how to leverage knowledge, influence, and meticulous planning. And now she would do the same to fight for accountability and systemic change. Immediately, she met with civil rights attorney Denise Harper, who agreed to take the case pro bono. Harper had built a reputation for handling high-profile civil rights cases, and Margaret knew her guidance would be critical. They reviewed every piece of evidence: body camera footage, security recordings, officer reports, and witness statements. It was overwhelming to see how quickly assumptions had escalated a minor malfunction into a humiliating detention. Yet, it was equally clear that the city and police department were liable for the mistakes. Meanwhile, the internal affairs team at the police department had opened a formal investigation. Officer Nathaniel Reed's actions were scrutinized, failing to verify the ATM malfunction, ignoring Margaret's repeated identification, misinterpreting cautious movements as resistance, and escalating rather than de-escalating the situation. Reed claimed he acted based on training and suspicion, but his decisions had violated multiple department policies. Within weeks, the internal report recommended termination. Tyler Clark, the security guard who had called the police, was also evaluated. The bank determined that his minimal training and inexperience contributed to the misunderstanding. While he wasn't criminally charged, the bank terminated his employment, citing a lack of judgment necessary for security work. The combined errors of a new security guard and a poorly trained officer had led to a nationally visible incident. By the end of the month, Margaret filed her federal civil rights lawsuit against the city. The complaint detailed her professional background, decades of service, her relationship with the police chief, and the absurdity of her detention. The lawsuit was clear. This was not a case about money. It was about accountability and preventing future abuses. Margaret wanted systemic reform, not just personal restitution. The city quickly realized the strength of her case. They reviewed body camera footage, which clearly supported Margaret's version of events. They also recognized that the viral videos had cemented public attention. Legal counsel advised a settlement rather than prolonged litigation. Negotiations began, and within weeks, the city agreed to pay $2.1 million in settlement. The funds were earmarked for both Margaret's personal losses and to establish initiatives to address racial profiling and police misconduct. Reed was terminated 3 weeks after the incident, making him ineligible for rehire in law enforcement. He also settled separately, paying $50,000 from his personal assets. Margaret reflected that personal accountability was rare in such cases, but necessary for meaningful reform. Tyler Clark's termination sent a message that mistakes have consequences, even if unintentional. Margaret used $500,000 of the settlement to establish the Williams Legal Defense Fund. Its mission: to provide free legal representation to victims of racial profiling and civil rights violations. Within the first year, the fund handled 34 cases, giving ordinary citizens resources and advocacy they otherwise would not have had. For Margaret, this was more than a legal matter. It was a continuation of her lifelong dedication to public service, now focusing on justice and protection of rights. At the police department, Chief Harrison implemented wide-ranging reforms. Quarterly implicit bias training was introduced for all officers. Investigation protocols were revised so that officers had to confirm evidence before detaining individuals. Disciplinary consequences for poor judgment became standard. The department shifted culture toward de-escalation, emphasizing that assumptions should never override facts. Margaret's experience became a case study in police training, illustrating how quickly bias could escalate minor incidents into public humiliation and legal liability. Social media, which had initially spread the arrest, now helped the reform movement. Clips of Margaret's press conference, her statements, and interviews with the chief provided context to the viral ATM footage. While the original videos remained online, the narrative had changed. People now saw Margaret as a respected public servant, wronged by assumptions and fighting for accountability. The clips became teaching material for media literacy programs and law school discussions about bias, public perception, and viral narratives. 2 years after the incident, Margaret returned to the police academy to speak to graduating officers. She recounted her story candidly, how a routine banking transaction had escalated into humiliation, how assumptions could endanger trust, and how officers needed to treat every individual with dignity and patience. Her voice was firm but composed, emphasizing that systemic problems could only be corrected if new officers understood the consequences of unchecked assumptions. The graduates listened intently, many taking notes, some visibly shaken by the reality of bias in law enforcement. The Williams Legal Defense Fund expanded, adding Know Your Rights workshops and policy advocacy initiatives. Margaret worked with local governments to implement reforms, using her experience to influence legislation. Within 5 years, 2 bills she supported passed, creating statewide reforms in police accountability and mandatory training on bias, de-escalation, and verification procedures. Margaret's life returned to consulting, but she became selective, dedicating herself to municipalities committed to meaningful reform. She traveled less, prioritized family, and spent time mentoring younger public servants and activists. Yet her personal story remained powerful. She continued to speak publicly, emphasizing that being well-educated, well-connected, and experienced does not protect Black people from being judged unfairly. Viral videos could destroy reputations in minutes, and correction often takes years. On the 5th anniversary of her arrest, Margaret returned to the First National Bank ATM, where it had all begun. She announced a partnership to establish financial literacy programs in underserved neighborhoods. These programs not only taught banking basics, but also informed participants about their rights during police encounters. Margaret reflected on her journey. She had never planned to become a civil rights advocate, expecting a quiet retirement focused on family. Life, however, demanded response over acceptance. Through legal action, public speaking, and community advocacy, Margaret reclaimed her dignity. Handcuffs and viral videos could not take it away. She realized that dignity was something she carried internally, strengthened by action and accountability. The $2.1 million settlement was symbolic, a recognition of harm and a resource for meaningful change. But it could not erase the trauma. What mattered most was the impact she created for others, ensuring that future victims of profiling would have support, legal representation, and advocacy she hadn't had in that initial moment. Margaret's story became a widely cited example of courage, accountability, and systemic reform. Her fight demonstrated that no amount of service or status could shield Black people from being judged unfairly, but deliberate action, advocacy, and resilience could create lasting change. Through the Williams Legal Defense Fund, she helped hundreds reclaim their rights, educate communities, and ensure that assumptions and bias would be challenged. By standing up, filing her lawsuit, and speaking publicly, Margaret sent a clear message. Injustice cannot be ignored, and even small incidents can spark significant change if addressed with courage and determination. Her experience was now a teaching moment, a symbol, and a blueprint for both reform and resilience. Her life, decades of service, and commitment to justice were no longer just professional accomplishments. They were a foundation for lasting societal impact. Margaret Williams turned a personal humiliation into a powerful legacy, ensuring that dignity, accountability, and fairness were not just ideals, but attainable realities.